Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guests Kathryn Leann Harris and Doug Stark. Kathryn and Doug are the editors of the recently published book entitled Interpreting Sports at Museums and Historic Sites, a comprehensive study of the central role sports have and continue to play in American culture and society. During the program, we'll be learning about the different frameworks for interpreting sports history, and through the use of some insightful and engaging case studies, we'll see how museums, historic sites, and other cultural institutions incorporate sports topics in their exhibitions and programming, together with examples and suggestions for how these organizations can go about creating a well-balanced sports history exhibit or program. Let's start by meeting Kathryn and Doug and then hearing all about interpreting sports at museums and historic sites. Welcome. I'm delighted you're both able to be here.
Thank you for having us.
You know, as someone who enjoys both a wide range of sports and all types of museums, I was excited when I first heard about your book, and I have to say, I learned so much from reading it. Couldn't imagine. Eager to hear even more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of use and somewhat helpful if each of you would briefly share just a little bit about your background and professional interests, please. Doug, would you start?
Sure. So my background is largely been in sports museums as a career. I've held positions at the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts, the United States Golf Association Museum in Far Hills, New Jersey, and most recently at the International Tennis Hall of Fame in Newport, Rhode Island. And my focus professionally has been on developing collections, creating exhibits, program development, and finding ways to tell diverse and more inclusive stories and to make them more engaging and relevant and accessible for a wide-ranging audience. And this project that we worked on was really an opportunity to give back to the profession and to provide, additional resources and thoughts that all museum professionals can learn about when they think about sports in museums.
Terrific, terrific. I mean, that's a good point that we'll keep hearing, I think, throughout, is even though the focus is sports museums, other institutions, the essays and advice go beyond those specialty areas to extend to all different museums. Kathryn, welcome. A little bit, please, about your background.
Yes, thank you so much. We're grateful to be here. So I went to undergrad and got a degree in history, and then actually took most of my 20s and focused on coaching and sales and kind of a different direction, and then decided to come back into the museum field. And when I did, started working at the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame, which is where I was at the time, and really just stumbled on something that struck a chord with me. I was immediately drawn to sports museums and to sports topics, and just thought I was seeing something that was really interesting and also something that I thought I could contribute to. So then I started to focus my career on museum studies and public history, and came to the Boston area. That led me to intersect with Doug at the Tennis Hall of Fame, where I was guest curator. So that's where we first met. And then I've worked for Adidas, the Adidas, as they say it, in the main campus, their corporate headquarters in Germany, in their history archive, and began this real huge affinity for sports museums that led me to research. I kept finding myself stumble into them everywhere I went, searching for an answer that I knew I was looking for, but couldn't quite seem to put my finger on. So this project became a way for me to really delve deep into that and find a way to express what I was finding that in the sports museum field and the museum field, and how those two intersected and what I thought might be going on.
Terrific, terrific. As I said, we'll hear more about those inspiration, motivation, and aims as we continue. Doug, would you pick it up and speak a little bit more of your collaborative nature of the work together and the stellar list of contributors to the book?
So Kathryn and I, it took us about 7 years to work on this project. So it was a long time coming when it finally got published. But the central idea which frames this book is, how can museums better incorporate sports into their interpretive planning? So that's the question we seek. And sports and museums are generally collaborative by nature. So within the museum field, there's art museums, science, history, children's museums, zoos, aquariums, and there's also sports museums. And the sports museum world is a very small subset of the larger museum sort of ecosystem. And they don't get as much recognition as some of the other museums do, but they're no less important. And so this was an opportunity to do a couple of things. One was to sort of bring the larger museum community to the sports museum world. And then to reverse that is to bring and to sort of fold in the sports museum community into the larger museum community. So one of our challenges was, how do we find enough writers to write about this? Because there's sort of three distinct areas that we learned about. There's sports historians, there's public historians, and then there's sports museums, halls of fame professionals. Rarely do any of the three actually intersect. So it was a little bit of a challenge to find writers. So we might, in some cases, have found a public historian who might be an expert in a certain topic like education or community or branding. They would write the theme essay and then would sort of incorporate within that theoretical structure the sports. And then we needed the case studies. And so we have more than 30 contributors to this book, nationally and internationally. And the case studies, we had to make sure that there were exhibits or programs at these museums that sort of supported the larger themes that we decided were important in the book. What we found was that not a lot of museums, non-sports museums, are actually doing sports museum work. So half of the case studies were from sports museums and half of the case studies were from non-sports museums. And it was a chance for people to take a critical look at their own institution and what worked well, what didn't work well, replicable practices, and how we can create a framework for other museums or other practitioners to use.
Yeah.
Continue, please.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that. So it was really important to us to have museum practitioners speak from the field, from their own institutions. We had a lot of discussions about, would we rather get an outside writer who would look into each exhibit and topic and with a critical eye and write from the outside in, from the outside looking in, but we really wanted each of these museum professionals to have their own voice, distinctly because there hasn't been a book like this before. And we wanted them to have the chance to speak about the work that they had done. I wanted to say one more thing about what we were really going after here. And as Doug said, sort of the challenge of finding contributors, because what we really noticed, sort of the central problem, is that sports are really inherent to the human experience, similar to eating. Everyone needs to play or move their bodies, and pretty much all of us do. And so we knew that, but at the same time, what we were finding is that the sort of standard sports commemorative practices that we were seeing in public spaces didn't totally reflect the breadth and depth of humanity and all of the interests that we really see there. They're often either really celebratory or commemorative in a way that actually would distance the visitors from even idolized sports heroes rather than connecting them. And more than that, they weren't really well attended. Often sports exhibits are not really well attended. And we knew that this was kind of the central problem that we were sort of looking at. And so finding contributors who were thought leaders, who could speak to something quite different than that, who could amplify the positive aspects of sports and at the same time lend insight and support to sort of often ignored challenges of the sporting world, and attract a large audience or a different audience than they had before. That was what we were looking for, and that was a bit of a challenge. So it was a lot of fun to seek out and find the examples that we were able to find, and it was really encouraging as well, and to see these authors speak for themselves on their work.
And Jay, I would just add one thing, which is, this book is part of a larger series, called Interpreting History through the American Association for State and Local History, and it's published by Rowman and Littlefield Publishing Group. So there's books on, interpreting slavery, interpreting food, interpreting military history, interpreting religion, but there hadn't been a book on interpreting sports. And in fact, this is the only book within the museum field that looks at how can you sort of interpret sports history. And so one of the challenges is there was very little scholarship written about sports museums and halls of fame and sports practices. So a lot of what is in this book is new, and it's the first time it's sort of been compiled in one area, because if someone was to do a sort of a historiographical review of the literature for sports museums, it would be very short. It would be a very short exercise, unfortunately.
No, the series is just outstanding. And as readers will find out, you've made significant contribution to the field. Leading into the book, Kathryn, would you briefly, because we'd love to see some of the examples, what are the different sections you've created that address different aspects of both understanding and implementing best practices in sports interpretation?
Yeah, so you mean like the design of the book, the structure of the book? Yeah, so the way that we structured it is we wanted to lead a practitioner through what we call a game plan. So their own action plan to creating a sports exhibit, and be able to take it step by step if they wanted to use the book in that way. So we start with comprehensive research and developing the themes and really thinking long and hard about institutional values of the museum's core institutional values, what matters the most to them, and then what they're seeing come out culturally, and what they find in the research. And then we ask them to think about expanding the scope of whatever they can already come up with, what the research is showing them, to be inclusive. So have a well-rounded exhibit that is inclusive of the breadth and depth of humanity that they might find in a specific athlete, a team, a community, whatever it is they're trying to interpret. And then also expand their scope by thinking globally, and also thinking very locally. So, and thinking about how both the local community and their larger global community connected to that sport or that team or that topic might be connected. We then ask them to think about their constituents. So this would be, for starters, the people that are the most invested in the sport, which would be fans, coaches, athletes, participants. And this makes sports really unique in comparison to other topics, because there is a very present, very active, invested collection of people who are either alive or are a generation or two removed from the modern sports era, and their relatives would still be alive, which means they're going to have an invested interest in attending the exhibit, seeing what museum professionals write about them. And that really changes in a lot of ways the way that museum professionals think about writing. It also has an effect on identity, the identity of the people connected to it. to the topic. And it's very important for museum professionals to remember that that identity is here and is central to the topic. And then we also ask them to think about branding. Branding, particularly global sports branding, is incredibly powerful and central in sports. And so we wanted them to think about how they might work with a brand, or if there might be a situation where they might want to work without a brand. There could be lots of reasons to do either of those. So the essay on branding really takes them through the various options to think through how to do either one. And then we really wanted them to think about engaging the audience that they attract. So connecting the community. This is, I call this like the low-hanging fruit part of the book, because community connection and sports are almost completely synonymous. So how they can connect their community, and also how they can think in complex ways about ways their community might be disenfranchised from sports, or might have access issues, might not feel like they belong, and how to pull people in. And then also to think about education. So sports is really well suited for museum education for a number of different reasons. And we really encourage them to think through how they can incorporate museum education programming. And then lastly, we encourage our museum practitioners to really think forward, look to the past to move forward, meaning there's a very long storied history with sports, particularly sports and politics in America and in the Western world. They're very intertwined. They're still very intertwined, and that has never really changed, despite at times it looking like that might have changed, or like sports sits on the periphery of culture, but it really doesn't. And so we encourage them to think about how they might challenge long-held notions about a certain athlete or a team or a community of people that are connected to a sport, and how they could begin to really be change agents within the sports and politics conversation, particularly, which has a lot to do with the cover photo that we chose.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a nice lead into taking a step back to part one, expand the scope, and the introductory topic essay that begins this part and the whole book is just exceptional, by Kathryn Douglas, called Stepping Up to the Plate, Interpreting Sports with Well-Rounded Exhibits, which follows a case study related to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. A few words about this, please, Kathryn.
Yeah, so Kathryn is the editor of Interpreting Slavery at Museums and Historic Sites, and also Interpreting Slavery for Children at Museums and Historic Sites. We were thrilled when she agreed to write this essay. She's also was an athlete of her own. She was an ice skater and has a sports perspective from her own life. So this essay in particular, the essay about the African American History and Culture Museum, was written by Damian Thomas and Shai Evans. And again, this is the African American History and Culture Museum at the Smithsonian. They have created a really phenomenal exhibit that it's basically just really exemplary of everything that we're trying to say in this book. And that is that there are, as we've noted, there's 3 different frameworks that museum professionals we see often put sports museum within: a very simplistic framework that's celebratory, exciting, fun; another framework that's commemorative, and speaks to the commemorative practices that we see in this country everywhere with statues. You see commemorative practices all over the place, and they're sort of an honoring and a paying homage to the subject, and in this case it would be the athletes or the team. And then finally, a more socially relevant framework that brings in deeper, more contextualized topics of humanity, both the challenges, the positive aspects, and really looks at the complexity of it. And what we see in this exhibit in the African American History and Culture Center at the Smithsonian is they thought long and hard about how to combine all 3 of those frameworks, and created an exhibit that did exactly that. And specifically because Damien noted that they are looking at a really challenging, complex, heart-wrenching topic of the African-American history with slavery in this country, and really wanted the exhibit to not only just like not scoot over that, but be able to acknowledge the real difficulties and challenges for the entire African-American population that they're interpreting with this exhibit. So at the same time, he didn't want to lose the celebration and the excitement of sports that come with this, or the celebration of the Black athletes that they are discussing. And so the Game Changers photo on the cover of the book really speaks to what they were able to do with this exhibit. This exhibit is a game changer exhibit. It does change the game of sports museum interpretation, because they took an incredibly complex topic and found a way to make it well balanced, and also to challenge some long held understandings, particularly about Jackie Robinson. And that one example that they highlight in the essay is a fantastic example of the wider cultural perspective actually being a bit off the mark from what they were finding in the research and the story that they really wanted to tell. And they just went right after that and did it the way that they thought would serve the community best.
No, they were quite eloquent in explaining just the different issues they were facing, the challenges, and what they weren't going to compromise, and what led to this outstanding exhibition. For the sake of time, we're going to keep moving so we can get as many examples as possible in the time allotted. And as we move on, next chapter has to do from local to global, interpreting sports and globalization by Bruce Kidd and Jenny Ellison. And here we see case study, Football Hallelujah, a European traveling exhibition that's written up wonderfully by Anne-Marie DeWilt. A very quick word, unfortunately, of what we have here, Kathryn.
Yeah, so this exhibit was an exhibit where Anne-Marie wanted to make the point that not only had football become like religion in Europe, but it actually had become the religion of Europe. So she took things like a chalice and juxtaposed it with a trophy, or a stadium and juxtaposed it with a sanctuary. And what we see here in the background, right in the foreground of the background, are jerseys that have actually, an artist has taken rival jerseys and cut them in half and into pieces and sewn them back together. And this part of the exhibit served as basically proof of what she was trying to say, because these images of these jerseys with rival teams sewn together incited so much anger and hatred in certain fan bases that the museum got death threats, they got bomb threats. There was a lot of real vitriol that came at them because of this installation. They also saw a lot of new audiences. They saw, she said, I saw fathers and sons come in our museum that I knew had never been there before. So it was very successful. They toured it to 6 different cities throughout Europe. And each city changed out the objects and some of the stories to reflect the local community. So it had this really broad reach outside of Amsterdam, where it went to more cities than just one, and made a really global statement actually about what is really going on with football, soccer. American soccer, football,
Right.
to the rest of the world.
I think we in the States here, and those of us in the Boston area, think we might be very avid sports fans, but it pales in comparison to how soccer is indeed more like a religion overseas.
And that religion will be on display in Boston in 2026 when the World Cup comes here.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous. Great to know about. Thank you. Want to move on to part 2, consider your constituents. And Kathryn, you wrote the introductory essay to chapter 3. A few words about that and the related case study we have.
Yes, can we flip to the next image?
Sure.
Okay, great. So Yeah, so this essay is thinking about what I was saying earlier about fans, coaches, athletes, participants, that there's a very invested personal identity. One that I think sometimes eludes museum professionals. How do we actually talk about that identity in a way that really both serves the subject matter and also the public? And what we really say is don't shy away from it. Embrace the fact that identity is a very central part of sports, and use that as a way to create the well-rounded exhibit so that you're including their humanity and acknowledging the importance that sports plays in our culture. I think there's all kinds of things that we'll find as museum professionals start to do that. This particular exhibit is in the Boston Logan Airport. It's called Deconstructing Stigma. It's sponsored by McLean Hospital. And there are lots of different examples. The idea here is to deconstruct the stigma around mental health. They have a lot of examples, but right here at the front, we see Brandon Marshall, who is a professional NFL football player and has also come out as being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and has since made that really the central part of his life. He's doing advocacy for that work. So he was willing to participate in the exhibit, is featured right here at the beginning of it. If anyone's in Boston Logan Airport, it's between gates B and C. There's a corridor, you can walk and see it. There's his story. And then we also included a few other examples here of athletes who also had the courage to come out and talk about their mental health and to really put a face to what they were going through. So running, for example, is an outlet. It's a great outlet for mental health. And there's, I think the next example, someone who plays basketball. You're not necessarily professional athletes, because like I said, pretty much everyone plays something, does something to move their body. And I love that they included non-professional athletes in the exhibit as well.
No, and couldn't be more timely, with mental health being just a major issue throughout the country these days, and most notably from past major events, the Olympics, just seeing how sports is definitely not spared from this as well. So fabulous and wonderful that it's so local that we can take advantage of. Moving on, sticking with Consider Your Constituents, another exhibition that was local, very near and dear to us. Doug, would you share a little bit about this case study, Dear Boston, Messages from the Marathon Memorial by Dan Yeager?
Yeah, so this exhibit, as most people remember, in 2013, there was the bombing at the Boston Marathon in April. And there was such a huge outpouring of support. People left shoes and messages and their running clothes, that it became sort of this overwhelming outpouring of support and love. But there was no place to exhibit it, no place to collect it, no place to actually, do anything with it. So there was an independent consultant, museum professional, Rainey Tisdale, who's from the Massachusetts area, and she sort of spearheaded a project to get this memorialized, to get it collected, to get it interpreted. So the City of Boston Archives became the repository for all of these items, and Historic New England sort of cleaned and fumigated all of the objects. But they were still looking for a place to sort of showcase. And at the 11th hour, the Boston Public Library, with the support of Iron Mountain, decided to do an exhibit for the month of April in the following year, 2014, to sort of lead up to and be part of the Boston Marathon a year later. And so this is an example of sort of all the shoes. What's interesting about this exhibit is they don't talk about how the bombing happened. They do not mention the two brothers. This is really about the support and the community, a lot of shoes, a lot of messages, a lot of, stories of heroic survival and helping people. And it did very well. This is even though there are memorials to the Boston Marathon, this is an opportunity to sort of make an exhibit like this and a story like this more permanent in Boston, to sort of share and to be part of the yearly marathon experience.
Definitely epitomizes what Boston Strong is all about, I think. Could hear much more, but want to move on. Staying with the same topic, Doug, consider your constituents. Getting back to what was referred to earlier, challenging with branding. A few words about this chapter and the case study we're going to hear now.
Yeah, so this essay is really important to think about the impact that museums can have on social awareness and advocacy issues. The National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian held 2 symposiums, offset by about 7 years, that were about the truth about Native appropriation in sports branding, and it had huge ripple effects. It resulted in the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Indians changing their mascot names. And I think even the museum didn't anticipate that was going to be the outcome. They sought to tell the truth and felt like they had a moment and an audience to do that. And it really worked. And I think that shows the impact that museums can have if they try to go after a social advocacy issue. Because museums are the trusted source that America has trusted museums. Yeah.
No, wonderful to see the impact it had on those 2 in particular sports organizations. Want to get to the next major part called engage your audience. And Doug, would you pick it up with connecting to your community, interpreting sports and place, the essay written by Kathryn and Terrence Healy, and then the case study we see right here, The Art of Baseball, which was at the Concord Museum, please.
Yeah, so this themed essay is really about your community and your local community and how sports are reflected in this local community. So the image that we see now, which is from the Concord Museum in Concord, Mass., which most people will know for Henry David Thoreau, Transcendentalism, Paul Revere, and yet a number of years ago, they did this exhibit about the art of baseball from a personal collection. And it was, a celebration of these items of the story of baseball, but it was also, they made it very relevant, very timely and connected to their community. It was very much a part of their social identity. They're not known for doing a sports exhibit, and yet they drew a wide audience of many individuals, like we referenced to an earlier exhibit in Amsterdam, who may not have never gone to a museum before, but there was baseball. They were able to partner with the Red Sox Foundation and the Lowell Spinners when they were the single A affiliate for the Red Sox to do story hour with the children. They had movies and programs, and their signature event towards the end of the exhibit was a panel discussion with the filmmaker Ken Burns, who did the baseball documentary for PBS, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, who everyone in the Boston area knows, who's written and spoken about her love of baseball. And this was really a way to have a very sort of strong community outreach and to tackle a topic that normally wouldn't be associated with their museum, and it was done very, very well.
Most definitely. As I shared with you earlier, I had the wonderful opportunity to visit and take it in as well. The next case study, Doug, building on that, somewhat local, a little further away, is Pedaling Through History, 150 Years of the Bicycle, from the collection of Glenn Ames, with the essay by William Brooks Jr.
Yeah, so this exhibit was done at the Henry Sheldon Museum in northern Vermont, part of the Green Mountain region. And this was from a personal collection of a bicycle enthusiast. And he had all different types of bicycles, as we see here on the screen. And this was very local and very community driven. The bicycling community in northern Vermont sort of rallied around this exhibit. They helped with promotions, they helped with bike rides, they helped with programming, they helped promotional and marketing. And you know, the museum, which is quite small but had this very sort of impactful exhibit, really has the pulse of the Green Mountain region and the biking community and promoting sort of a healthy lifestyle. You know, it's a fascinating exhibit to see the evolution of bicycling equipment over time, and to see how it's changed and how the safety standards have changed. But they did a really nice job of sort of bringing in that local community and making the community feel as if the exhibit, that they contributed to it as well.
And I think if I remember correctly from reading that essay, also a terrific example of seeing people maybe for the first time who hadn't been to the museum just because of the attraction of the topic and the collection.
Yeah.
Terrific. And wanna get to the next major section, Kathryn, which we touched on just briefly earlier, empowering with knowledge, interpreting sports through education. A few words about that, and then the case study we're gonna spend some time with.
Yes. So this chapter was really important to us because we wanted museums to recognize the power of museum education with sports and what sports can really do for their museum education. So it really hits to all the major STEM topics, where technology, math, science are all really central to sports, and all can be interpreted. Of course, history as well. So virtually just about any school topic that they would like to cover, they really could use sports as a topic. And one of the main reasons to do it is because it's very accessible and engaging and exciting to school children, or adults. If you want to do museum education programs based that are for adults, it's it's accessible. It's a way to really get them engaged and excited about what you're talking about. So I think it's really important. This example, this is one of the more fun examples in the book. It's called In a Skate. It's the Lemelson Center at the Smithsonian created this program called In a Skate because they are the Center for Innovation at the Smithsonian. And this was the combination of innovation and skateboarding. And maybe my favorite quote of the whole book comes from this essay where they had one of the participants say, "Dude, I'm in a museum." It was, and I think it's really fitting because it shows their unique culture, the skating culture, and also that they're rarely highlighted. They don't get space in the public eye. And here, the Lemelson Center really saw an opportunity to talk about innovation and technology and sports through the skateboarding lens. And it was very effective for what they were trying to do.
You know, I know we don't have an image right now, but a word of another very successful education program locally, coming out of TD Garden, having to do with bullying. Would you share a word about that, either of you?
Yeah, I would be very happy to share about that essay, because I think it's a program that quite honestly could easily and probably would benefit from being in every city in the country. This is called Boston versus Bullying. Boston versus Bullies is the name of the program. They've since said they kind of wish they'd named it Boston versus Bullying, because the central purpose of the program is to educate children about all of the people involved in a bullying incident with compassion, including the person who's doing the bullying, and to really teach children what they can do. The central message is mostly around that the bystander actually has the most power That exhibit came from the museum director's son was involved in a bullying incident, and he was a bystander. And he asked, why didn't you do anything? And he said, well, I didn't know what to do. And he said, well, we need to do something about that. So they brought in, what they did was create a video series that teachers can use year after year after year. So the first time they use it, that they can continue to repeat it without the museum having to continue to revisit the school every year. Makes it very accessible, and they can multiply it out to a lot of different schools. They asked athletes from the local area to film for them to help contribute to the program, so that the kids are seeing athletes that they know talk to them on the videos. And then they walk them through a booklet around the education. They also have a lot about bullying that happens with children with disabilities, because that's one of the largest targets of bullying is children with disabilities. So they have an entirely separate book dedicated to that, and they're seeing really positive results. They've now put this in front of over 200,000 school children. The incidences of bullying in the New England region are coming down in large part in connection to this program. It's very effective.
No, it's an award-winning program, just incredible recognition, and rightly so. Moving to an overview now, hearing the different sections. Doug, would you please share, maybe give us a little summary of the different building blocks museums can take to develop in-depth dialogue when interpreting sports and sports-related content, please?
Well, I think, all museums would need to have a research plan, to research their subject. I think they need to be willing to have difficult conversations internally, to build support from the top down and from the bottom up, understanding who the constituents are, the various invested identities, understanding your audience, community involvement, your education. It's really taking sort of a holistic approach to doing this. We've talked about in this segment about, that sports can provide more nuanced and complex stories, that it's not just about the victory, but it's about the humanity. It's about understanding all of the different forces, both good and bad, that go into telling a story. And I think people should take that into account when they're sort of in their building blocks. Like it's a process internally. It's about having the conversations. It's about building support. It's about really doing your research. It's about knowing your audience, your constituents, who may not be an audience, but who you can bring into your fold, how to engage the community, what programming might work. So it's really about, how can you really create a game plan? And as we've learned through this project, we know a lot of sports cliches, so we can speak in cliches, and this would be one. But really, to think of it as a process and think of it as something that's holistic and broad-based would be our advice.
What's been some of the reaction and feedback to the book, Kathryn, from people both in and out of the museum field so far?
We're getting really good feedback. As you know, it just launched. Now it'll be about 2 months ago. So I'm sure we'll know a lot more in maybe a year or so. So far, we're getting really good feedback. I would say from museum professionals that are not sports museum professionals, or not really even sports fans, not really connected to sports in any way. We're getting some feedback from them that is kind of really what a lot of what we wrote the book to hear. We wanted them to have access to sports topics in a different way. One of the feedback that some of the feedback we've gotten includes a quote from Asia Bain that says, "This is everything I never knew I wanted to know about sports." And that was, to me, that just that summed it up. I said, okay, then we've done it. We've done what you needed. And then we're also getting really good feedback from sports museum professionals as well, finding a way to talk about sports in a different way. And I think maybe getting some support that they haven't had before, and an advocate to say, yeah, there is something else here that you could talk about, or you could do, and you could think in different ways. And we want to help you think about how to do that. And so far we're getting some good feedback from them. And then the last thing I'd say about that is, what we see from the examples that are in the book, because I think that's a lot of what the feedback we've received is even from our 32 contributors, that they've, even doing this work themselves, they've been able to create disparate dialogue amongst disparate groups. They're seeing that you can create sports exhibits that appeal to both sports fans and casual visitors. You can bring in new audiences, increase your audiences. You can tell stories of triumph, determination, perseverance, agony, grace under pressure, success, and failure. It can kind of all be in there. And that really the country as a whole is starting to have a more nuanced conversation about sports and sports topics, and museums can meet the public in that space. And sports have a unique power to bring people together. And so it's a really great way to talk about much bigger topics than win and loss records and trophies. There's so much more that sports can illuminate for us culturally.
No,
And we're really seeing that happening.
Building on that quote you shared, I found myself from chapter to chapter just saying, I mean, why didn't I ever think of this? And just kept learning more and more and more. Sort of piggybacking on that, looking back now that the book is done and it's out, for each of you, any surprises or things that most stood out from all the 7 years of research and writing, and finally the culmination of a book that come to mind and you'd like to share? Doug?
Well, I thought it was a wonderful process. It really had its starts and stops, but collaborating really benefits a project. And working that way, I think, enhances your project. But I also learned that there are a lot of institutions that are doing really good things with sports, and they're certainly trying. I mean, there's wonderful case studies of museums and exhibits that I don't think either of us have thought would have been possible. We recently hosted a workshop with the New England Museum Association about this book and about how museums can use this. And every attendee representing their museum had great projects that they were working on. I mean, hopefully that they'll come to fruition, and if they need assistance, they can get to us. But there's a lot of creative thinking around sports. And I think sports is entering a period where it's going to become much more part of the mainstream conversation in this, and not just, who scored the winning touchdown. And even in New England, there's a lot of stories that people don't know about in museums and programs. And I think we've been pleasantly surprised.
No, and it's such a rich area for museums that it's going to be a natural ticking off point to just see more and more of the type of exhibits that you've highlighted here and have provided guidance for people in the field to put together in years to come. Kathryn, any final thoughts about your reflecting back and what might have stood out or surprised you?
Yeah, I think in a way I want to piggyback on what Doug said about all the amazing work that is out there. I also think the other thing that surprised me is how central politics have been. I mean, sports has been to politics for the nation's entire history, and how connected it is to commemoration and how connected it is to the nation's identity. And yet, particularly in the last few decades, we've seen this sort of like more escapism take on sports, where it seems like there's a conversation that, well, aren't these two really separate? And the reality is they were never separated. They're very entwined, and it's important for us to know that and to highlight it, to not shy away from it. And that's what museum professionals do really well, is we find a way to talk about things that are difficult to talk about in any other space. It's museums is the place to do that. And I think sports in a lot of ways have been relegated to some sort of periphery of cultural conversations, but the reality is they're very, very central to our nation's identity and our cultural conversations. So that surprised me in a way. It was the answer that I had been looking for. It was the missing piece that every time I would walk into a sports museum and think something's missing. And that's what it is. It's an acknowledgement of where sports really lives in our culture and how important it is for us to talk about that openly and talk about it, even if that's going to be difficult, and see where it leads us.
Well, I think it exemplifies too what just good education is, that it doesn't happen isolated, that it's integrated for all the different disciplines, connected to the real world, makes for vibrant school curriculum and beyond, and definitely having sports museums, historic sites, cultural institutions being right in that arena as well. In closing, just a quick word maybe from either of you of current and upcoming projects that you're involved with. Doug?
So we are, in conjunction with the New England Museum Association, we're going to be starting a sports community of practice. Where we continue to engage museums and museum professionals in this discussion, whether it's with workshops, virtual sessions, field trips. But we're going to try, hopefully, if not monthly, every other month, to have regular programming around this topic.
Oh, that's very exciting. Kathryn?
Yeah, so again, to echo what Doug said, the goal right now for both of us is to propagate this message as far and as wide as we can. So we're looking at speaking engagements and conference panel sessions and working on projects that really fit what we're looking at, or people who have gotten some, are looking to flesh this out a little bit more and find creative ways within their institution to explore sports topics. So that is our main focus as this book comes out, is how far and wide can we spread this message? How many museum professionals can we reach? Which is why we're so grateful to be able to be here today with you.
Well, in closing, just want to thank you both again for taking the time to be here. Again, learned so much more. Need to take a second dive at your book now to go through some of those other case studies. I didn't have the chance yet. And we'll definitely be on the lookout for some upcoming workshops or other opportunities to see some of the essays and practices put it into practice itself. So look forward to finding out that, and encourage people to pick up a copy of the book as well. Continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Jay, very much.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us, and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.